Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the World Affairs Councils of America's monthly author series, Cover to Cover, brought to you virtually every month for about an hour with a distinguished author. And today we are thrilled to have David Ottaway, a Middle East expert and author of the book Mohammed bin Salman, The Icarus of Saudi Arabia, ? This book came out a year ago, but it's timely for us given the recent visit of President Biden to Saudi Arabia. And also we have several council leaders and WACA board members, a group of 10, who next week will be traveling to the kingdom. And so I hope many of them will have questions for David. Before I introduce him, I want to mention as a housekeeping rule, we've already received well over a dozen questions from registrants, which exceed 100. That's great, nationwide. And you're welcome to post questions as we go into the chat box or the Q&A, and I'll be monitoring them so that I can bring them into the conversation. So welcome again, and especially David, welcome to you. Welcome back to Cover to Cover. You were here with your wife, Marina, a few years ago for your book then, A Tale of Four Worlds, the Arab region after the uprising. It's behind me. And we're here to discuss your latest book published last year, Mohammed bin Salman. David is a journalist by career, 35 years and then some with the Washington Post, much of it in the Middle East and Africa, and also as an investigative reporter in Washington, D.C. before he retired in 2006. He's won numerous awards for his journalism at home and abroad, and was a finalist twice for the Pulitzer Prize. He is now and has been for several years a fellow with focus on the Middle East at the Woodrow Wilson Center. David, welcome and congratulations again on your book and its continued.
Pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much. We have a lot to talk about in regards to MBS himself, domestic politics in Saudi Arabia, foreign policy, including relations with the United States. But I'd like to start very broadly, as I often do. You open your book with conundrums and mysteries of a kingdom that you've been covering since October 1972. Why don't you talk about why Saudi Arabia still remains perhaps misunderstood or less well understood than it ought to be in this country? And what captivates you?
I guess the central conundrum for me has always been about Saudi Arabia, is why this country that has such religious authority and power as the center of Islam, the birthplace of Islam, that has this huge economy, which this year is approaching $1 trillion, is centrally located in the world, has never been able to successfully assert itself globally. And it would appear to have all the ingredients for being able to do that, but it has not been able to do that. And just to, you say, well, why is that? Why do I think that? I think the main problem is they have no military power. They lack military power and depend on us for that. And that makes our relationship with them very complicated because, as you can imagine, they don't particularly like being dependent on us for their success in the war, say, in Yemen or elsewhere. So that's part of the complications of our life. But the conundrum is why this country that seems to have all these assets still fails to assert itself convincingly as a global player.
Do you source the reason for that within its domestic political structure or the economy or just sheer population?
Well, other than the fact that they have a terrible military in terms of the ability to project power, military power, I think the kind of society it's been has made it very hard for anybody or Westerners, let's say, non-Muslim Western people from the West to go there. and to appreciate it, because they had this understructure and superstructure provided by the very ultra-conservative Wahhabis that kept that country in a social box where there were no movies, there was no singing, it was really a grim place. So it wasn't exactly where people wanted to flock to in order to appreciate its assets.
Although they flock to Mecca and the religious
Muslims. The Muslims flocked.
Yes.
But not Christian Westerners or Jews. So it was a closed, in some ways, a closed society. It wasn't closed to Muslims, but it was closed otherwise. And then the government was closed. It was closed to journalists. We used to have a terrible time talking to anybody in the government. And
they wouldn't even let you in Riyadh, as I recall. You would be
stuck there. If you asked to see the king, nobody would see you, because they waited until the king made up his mind whether he was going to see you or not. And practically always he wouldn't see you. So it was a very frustrating experience for journalists to go there too. So that's another reason why I think it never gained the prominence of a place to go to for tourism or just to visit the sites. They have a lot of Nabatean sites, but the Wahhabis didn't want anybody to deal with the past culture of Saudi Arabia. The Wahhabi influence was really a deadening influence and a kind of barrier between Saudi Arabia and the outside Western Christian world.
You've experienced the kingdom up close in person, and you've also met Mohammed bin Salman. Would you say that his meteoric rise to a position of power in the last 5 years is the most surprising thing that you've encountered about the country in the last 35 years or so, since 72?
Well, his meteoric rise, plus how he's changed the place and the way it's governed in such a short time. I mean, to begin with, the meteoric rise, nobody knew who he was. He had never had any prominent position in the government. He was sort of a note taker at the side of his father, who was first governor of Riyadh and then crown prince and then king. So he was sort of people saw him next to his father, but nobody understood that he was going to emerge and play the kind of role he has. So he was an unknown, and that's very unusual. Second, he had no experience in government, and that was always a prerequisite to rising in the ranks, the royal ranks, to become a minister of one of the main ministries. And nobody he didn't talk, so nobody knew what he was thinking. I mean, he was a mystery kind of person. And then suddenly, as soon as his father becomes king at the end of January 2015, he emerges as minister of the armed forces. From nowhere, he becomes minister of the armed forces. I mean, so, and then
he's 32.
At that point, he was.
Oh, he's younger.
I think he was 29.
Yeah. Pardon me.
So he just shoots in because of who his father is, the king. He's suddenly head of the armed forces, a guy who never was in the armed forces. So, and then he starts this, competition with Mohammed bin Nayef, who's the interior minister and the guy that the CIA and the U.S. government thank again and again for his success in fighting Al-Qaeda and cracking down on extremists. He gets involved in the struggle with Mohammed bin Nayef, and of course he loses that struggle, and his father appoints him in June 2017, a little bit more than 2 years after he first comes into the government, as crown prince. So, I mean, that is meteoric, and particularly in Saudi terms. There's been nobody that's come to power this quickly that way before in the history of Saudi Arabia.
Patrick Ryan, my colleague who leads the Tennessee World Affairs Council, asks, why was it so easy for MBS to gain this stranglehold on power when King Abdullah had gone to such lengths to institutionalize succession?
One word or two words: his dad, who just happened to be king and was able to clear the way for him. The king actually fired 2 crown princes to make way for him. If anybody else than his father, I don't think he could have done it. He owes this all to his father, and I compare his father to Daedalus, the guy who helped Icarus get off the island.
I want to get to the subhead of your book and why you see MBS as Icarus. But before doing that, you have set this, it's not simply a biography, really. It's a larger look at Saudi Arabia in the context of what it's been struggling to do for so long, which is to reform and modernize its society and billed as a reformer and hailed as such by Tom Friedman and other Western journalists. There was a lot of reform underway before he got there. Talk about what had been accomplished, say, since the mid to latter part of the 20th century that set him up to do more.
Well, before King Salman became king, it was King Abdullah. Under Abdullah, a lot of things began to happen. Abdullah, to begin with, he allowed the local media to start publicizing these horrendous confrontations between Wahhabi clerics and Saudi citizens, and the way they were treating Saudi citizens because they didn't live up to the Wahhabi standards of dress, or they were in the wrong place, or they were with a woman that they didn't know who it was. That was really, I would say Abdullah opened the door to allow this behavior to be criticized. He organized elections at the municipal level. He allowed elections at the municipal level throughout the country. He authorized women to run in those elections. One picture I remember of him in the newspapers that just had everybody agog was King Abdullah surrounded by a group of women who were attending some conference, I can't remember which one, and none of them had on the hijab or covered their face. Now, in Saudi society, that was a breakthrough. So Abdullah had started the ball rolling, but he was still very cautious. For example, allowing women to drive. Now, when I went there during Abdullah's time, there was talk that the king was considering allowing women over 40 years old to drive first and see if that worked. They were very concerned about, teenagers and young Saudis getting together, and they would be able to do that across with men and women illicitly out in the desert or wherever, if they were able to drive cars. So the clerics were worried about the promiscuity that would promote if women were also allowed to drive cars. So he started the ball rolling, Abdullah, but then he kind of, he was getting old too. And he lacked the energy to kind of push through on these reforms. And they kept saying, well, we can't make this reform because this not for religious reasons, but because the society's not ready for it yet. That was always this excuse. The Saudi society is very conservative. They're not ready for this yet. So he didn't make the breakthrough on some of these big issues. The most obvious one and the most painful one for them was allowing women to drive. The last country in the world where women couldn't drive. And Mohammed broke through and said, yes, this is going to happen. He has much more energy, has much more kind of determination, and he has a different relationship with the Wahhabi establishment than Abdullah did.
Well, let's talk about that significant and symbolic change where women in Saudi Arabia, the last country in which a woman can drive, are driving. What has that really led to in the broader scope of opportunity for women and civil liberties generally?
Well, depends which liberties you're talking about. For women, economic liberties have grown much greater. They have more access to the economy, more access to jobs. Unfortunately, they also make up the bulk of the unemployed now. They're like 10 or 11% unemployed in the country, and the women make up the vast majority of the unemployed. But still, jobs are open. They're able to drive. They are able to get their own passports now without having a male figure allowing them to do it. They're getting more independence from, they had a guardian system for women where the male, whether it was the husband or the father or even sometimes the brother, they needed to get permission to do anything. Well, now they can travel on their own. They can check into a hotel on their own. The jobs available to them are much broader. And a very interesting thing, women now can play sports starting at school, which didn't happen before. And there is now a women's basketball league and soccer, well, they call it football, soccer league starting up. So women are also, they can do all kinds of activities like that they couldn't do before.
Would you, he's not facing election, but would you say that women and youth are MBS's base in terms of legitimacy, or is it a mixture with the clerics and, of course, his own family?
I think he's tried to shift the base of political support for him and for the government from the Wahhabi establishment to groups like women, young people, and sort of middle-aged people. I mean, you have to remember now there's all kinds of entertainment allowed. They're building just outside of Riyadh, a place which is kind of a Disney World of Saudi Arabia, although they say it's going to be 3 times as large as Disney World. So in that sense, there's a lot going on and a lot of progress. Don't talk about when we get to the political sphere. It's a totally different story. It is the most repressive regime I have had any contact with since I've been covering that country for almost half a century. He does not want any political activity. He does not want any criticism. He has just locked, politically I'm talking about, he's locked the place down.
So we have two
Only-
questions. We have two questions on that. So I want to probe it to let
Okay.
you elaborate. One from Ronan Amali, who's at the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston, and also from the World Affairs Councils of America's board, Usmar Abib, who will be on that delegation I referenced. Ronan asks, MBS has the will and, if necessary, the brutality to rule, but is there any viable opposition to his growing authority? You seem to imply no. And Usmar Abib asks, similarly, what would be the threat to his authority or position?
Well, the threat is in that country has always been thought of as coming from the extreme right, from the ultra conservatives. Remember in 1979, a group of hardline conservatives seized control of Mecca and the mosque there. It was a huge deal. And ever since then, the governments and the kings and the royal family have been very cautious and careful and worried about the Wahhabi extremists that are even outside of the government establishment, Wahhabi establishment. Everybody, with all these reforms going on, everybody has been expecting a backlash from this element of society. To everybody's surprise, or let's say to Saudiologists' surprise generally, we have not seen it. And I think for several reasons. One is that if any of them get out of line, he either sends them home and puts them under house arrest or puts them in jail and fires them from their jobs. So they know if they speak out now, they're going to lose their stipend, their monthly stipends, and be out of a job. The government is watching them very closely and has been doing some re-education of the clerics, but above all, just refusing to allow them to speak out or to criticize anything. And so that doesn't seem, at this point, doesn't seem to be, it's certainly not a visible or known threat. Inside the royal family, he's got them under control. He's destroyed all the centers of power inside the economic centers of power, like Al-Walid bin Talal, the richest private individual in Saudi Arabia. He was thrown into the Ritz prison when they arrested, 360 so-called corrupt businessmen and princes, et cetera, back in 2018, I guess that was, November. He's destroyed any kind of centers of power in the economic world that might challenge him. Al-Walid used to be very outspoken. Since his time in the Ritz, he hadn't said a word of criticism or suggestion or et cetera. I mean, he's really also forced the business world to line up with him. And if they don't, they find themselves in house arrest or country arrest and can't travel. So that's not a source of challenge to him at this point. I don't see it either from the business committee nor from the military. The right wing, the ultra conservatives, you can't see it. There may be, but I don't see it.
Independent clerics, perhaps?
From where?
Independent clerics who dissent?
He's thrown a number of them in jail.
Yeah.
And then they're staying in jail. He's really silenced all criticism. So it makes it really hard to say, is there some group in the military scheming? Well, the military is really busy with Yemen and trying to get out or either win the war or get out. So I don't think that challenging Mohammed bin Salman is high on their action list. So I don't
see.
see, I don't see any visible challenges to his becoming king.
We're talking with David Ottaway, who is a Middle East scholar at the Wilson Center and also author of Mohammed bin Salman, the Icarus of Saudi Arabia. This is a good point, David, I think, to transition to foreign affairs. But in a way to do it, I have a question from David Edick of our San Diego World Affairs Council, who asks how much of MBS's focus and attention is directed at domestic affairs versus international relations. Do you see it in balance, or does it shift?
Well, I'm quite sure how you proportion it. I mean, he's really been busy with the domestic changes taking place and consolidating his power. So I would say the first years of his reign as crown prince, king, have been certainly focused domestically on consolidating his power and his popularity and assuring the transition to become king. He has been quite active in foreign policy, but it's been a disaster, everything he's done. That's where you have another side to Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, as we say, when you come to foreign policy. Maybe we want to get into that later, but I would say no, his focus has been mainly on consolidating power and bringing about these reforms, bringing the Wahhabi establishment under control, and protecting himself against challenges from either the left, right, or center.
So in terms of relations with the United States, though, which has been a 75-year or longer, very important relationship, we have seen the oil shocks of the 70s, the 9/11 attacks, and now a real deterioration, especially under Obama, in large part, I think, due to the Iran nuclear deal, even with Trump because of Jamal Khashoggi, the Saudi journalist who was assassinated by decision of Crown Prince Salman. It's not good. Why should the U.S. affiliate with MBS, asks Linda Barker.
I think part of the answer is Iran. And we don't know yet whether there's going to be any agreement to go back to the old nuclear, limitations on Iran, or Iran is going to continue to go on towards developing nuclear weapons. They're up to 60% enrichment of uranium, and it's very easy to go to 90% in order to make nuclear grade material. And until we know what our relationship is going to be with Iran, Saudi Arabia, because of where it's located, is geographically important to us. And in order to, if we do get into kind of a showdown, a military showdown with Iran, Saudi Arabia is still important because it is the leader of the Gulf Cooperation Council, the GCC, which includes the 6 Arab monarchies of the Gulf. Now, not all of them are going to follow Saudi Arabia if there were a confrontation with Iran. But Saudi Arabia, either publicly or quietly under the table, will probably cooperate with Israel and the United States if it comes to military action. So, and we don't know yet, but it doesn't look good. Doesn't look like we're going to have a disagreement, but maybe it'll pull a rabbit out of the hat at the last moment. But So they're still militarily important to us, and geographically important to us as being the largest country on the other side of the Persian Gulf. Oil is not a big issue anymore for us. We've gone way down on the amount we get oil we get from. We used to get 1.5 million barrels a day. I think we're down to 300,000 or 400,000 barrels a day. We're way, way down, and we're producing our own oil. In fact, we are now competitors with them on exports of oil to the rest of the world. So that whole relationship has changed. So I think Iran is a major factor about why we have to keep our relations functional, as opposed to cutting them off totally, until we know what's going to happen with Iran.
How do you appraise, you mentioned earlier about Saudi's ability to project military power. We have a question in that sense from Michael Shackleton of the Indianapolis World Affairs Council on the civil war in Yemen. You could also touch on intervention in Lebanon as being part of MBS's Icarus moment. But what do you see the long-term outcome of that morass?
I think the issue of why they can't project military power is very important, because it's a key element of any major power. You got to be able to project military power. They have real problems, and they have never wanted to have a strong military that might challenge them. So for political reasons, they've kept the military kind of withering on a vine. And the only decent part of their military is their Air Force. They have pretty good pilots. Their targeting, as we saw in Yemen, has not been great. But the Air Force is at least, it's a decent Air Force. The military is not the Army is not a decent force. Their anti-missile system protection has gotten quite good. Their Navy is very weak. So, and a lot of this is for political reasons. And just think, you know, the fact that the king made his son defense minister, having had no experience in the military, already gives you some idea of why they have problems with projecting power. Their performance in Yemen has been very poor on the ground. In the air, they've had a lot of misfirings and bombed the wrong targets, et cetera, et cetera. They have not acquitted themselves well militarily there. I don't see them building a strong army, even despite all this. They've been very careful not to send a lot of their own troops into Yemen. They're all Yemenis that have been trained and armed and paid by the Saudis to go fight. So I don't see any change in their attitude about building an effective fighting force. And here, right next door, a little country by the name of United Arab Emirates has turned out, they've decided they're going to have a military. And they built a military, and they sent their troops and planes to Afghanistan to fight with us, et cetera. So they could have taken that road. You know, we're going to have a really effective military, but they have not.
And UAE was really a staunch ally that has seemed to abandon Riyadh over.
They did.
How in general do you feel, in a non-military way, Saudi's influence is over the other Gulf countries and nearer neighbors, whether allies or not? They just apparently seem to have patched things up a little bit with Qatar. where they had instituted a blockade along with UAE, Egypt, and Bahrain. What's going on regionally there?
Well, we used to talk about, as journalists, the Saudi-led Gulf Cooperation Council. Well, I don't think it leads it anymore. It has lost a great deal of influence. United Arab Emirates also wants a place in the international landscape for itself, and so does Qatar. And Qatar has enormous gas resources, so they have the economic base to have an independent policy. And Kuwait, up at the head of the Persian Gulf, and Oman at the bottom, they like playing it neutral. They don't want to tangle with Iran. So Saudi influence, even over its immediate neighbors, all of whom are monarchies, has, in my view, gotten less and less. And the determination, particularly of the United Arab Emirates and Qatar, to stand up on their own and not kowtow to Saudi Arabia, to have their own foreign policy, to leave Yemen if they want to, and leave it up, sort of abandoning Saudi Arabia to deal with Yemen on its own. These are all signs of a Gulf Cooperation Council that has fragmented in terms of cohesion, military cohesion, tremendously, and political cohesion.
Does it weaken also the religious authority that you referenced before?
Internationally?
Yeah.
I haven't seen any signs of that. There's still the Hajj. Everybody, you have, I don't remember how many millions come every year to pray in Mecca. I mean, no, they still have a lot of religious influence. But I do think they became worried about their missionaries who got involved with Al Qaeda in some cases, like in Somalia, and they've cracked down on their missionaries, and to be sure they're not sowing the kind of extremist religious philosophy that came out of the Wahhabi establishment previously.
So then, do you have a sense that MBS has a strategy, or is it more just an ambition to be a great king, a great global leader? Does he have strategic goals to move his country into the leadership position regionally and globally that has escaped it for all these decades?
Well, he's placing his bets on a place called Neom, which is a futuristic city that he's building up in the northwest corner, not too far from the Jordanian border and not too far from Egypt across the Red Sea. And Neom stands for new future. Neo is Greek or Roman, Greek, I guess, for new. And the M is for Mustaqbal, which is future in Arabic. So new future. This is a city that will be no cars, totally powered by wind and solar, where everybody will only have to walk 5 minutes between their job and their home. And he's got all these visions of a new kind of, sort of a new lifestyle, and he's an incredible dreamer. I mean, he's now come up with this idea. He calls it the line. Well, the line, this is where people are supposed to live. It's like taking skyscrapers and turning them around their side and connecting them. And it's gonna go on for 75 miles, one solid block. In his dream, in his latest dream. And this is kind of crazy, but he's doing other things there that make more sense. putting a lot of money. He wants to make that a center for the production of hydrogen, the new the source of energy, clean energy for the world.
Mhm.
He's signed a big deal with I think it's called Air Power or Water Power. It's a company in Pennsylvania to build a $7 billion plant in Neom. It will be powered by wind and solar, and it will produce hydrogen that they will export to the world. So that's part of his, he wants to be on the cutting edge of technology, as well as these crazy ideas of how people should live, and in these, this line building stretched across the.
And how long is it supposed to take for that all to materialize?
Well, the first thing he did was to build palaces for himself and his family. So he's built the palaces. I was up there in, I guess it was December 2019, just before COVID. They have a planning camp where, there's a camp there where people are living the work week, Sunday through Thursday. They've started building the infrastructure for part of it. It's going to be in phases. The cost estimate now is $500 billion to build this city. And I'm sure it's going to be much more expensive when they actually get around to build it out. But so that's his big bet on the future. This is a city that's like the shining new city for humanity, not on the hill, but along the shore of the Red Sea and the mountains behind it.
Okay, well, they've struggled to advance their fourth industrial revolution, and I guess we have to watch this space. I know that there have been a number of recent initiatives in public diplomacy, and a plan that my colleagues will hear about opening up to tourism. A big article in the Wall Street Journal recently talking about a $1 trillion objective. But Jim Kaufman from World Boston asks, for example, as a part of this public diplomacy, why does MBS, what is he after in pursuing the LIV golf tour initiative? Golf, not golf, golf.
Well, first, what is LIVE? It's called Leave or Live. LIVE stands for, it's Roman numerals LIV, 54. And LIVE is 54 holes of golf instead of 72 holes of golf. But the super group he set up, it's set up to challenge the Professional Golf Association of America, PGA. They're throwing, I think, well close to $600 or $700 million into this project. They have been buying golfers who are dissatisfied with the GPA to come over and play in their tour and their league. And when they do that, they can no longer play the GPA tour. So it's a big deal to leave. So the Saudis have had to pay, it is said, Phil Mickelson, who's probably one of the best known golf players in the country. Phil Mickelson got $200 million to defect from the GPA to come over to play with Leave. It's also rumored that the Saudis offered Tiger Woods $1 billion to come play, leave the PGA and come over to LIV. The Saudis are spending a lot of money on this, and it's their public investment fund, their sovereign wealth fund. They call it a PIF, Public Investment Fund, has so far probably spent $400 somewhere, but I think 400 million on, this year they're having 7 matches. And most of them are here in the United States. I think it's our friend President Trump is hosting 2 of them. I think the last one is down in Miami. The total number is 8 this year. And this is a system where the winners get, like $5-10 million. Nobody is cut. Everybody gets at least $125,000 for participating. There are 48 players going around, and then they have teams of 4 each. And if the winning team also gets money, they're just drowning golf in money in order to undermine the GPA and establish a Saudi-financed golf tour. Now, why are they doing this? Why are they doing this? I think there are a number of reasons. One is they're in sharp competition, we already mentioned this, with the United Arab Emirates and Qatar in international sports, and in particular, what we call soccer, they call football.
Qatar hosting the World Cup, the FIFA World Cup.
Qatar's hosting the World Cup. But
November.
Qatar, a number of years ago, bought a football club in Paris, Saint-Germain. United Arab Emirates bought Manchester City, I think it's called. And the Saudis, in order to keep up with the Joneses, in this case with their 2 monarchs neighbors, has bought Newcastle. So this is a way for these countries that are not well known to become known in the international scene. So I think the competition they feel from Qatar and the UAE is considerable, and they're just sort of, they feel, doing, at least when it comes to soccer, the same thing that our colleagues, and they want to be playing that game too. The GPA, I think, taking on the GPA, golf GPA.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
The American GPA is a different story. It is not clear to me why they want to be so in the face of American sports like this. And of course, what it's led to is journalists, media asking, Phil Mickelson and Greg Norman and others who have defected to leave. Well, what do you think about Saudi human rights? And what do you think about the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, authorized by Mohammed bin Salman? So this has raised the whole issue of the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, authorized by Mohammed bin Salman, again and again and again. And this is not what MBS wants. So I do wonder whether that particular step is turning out to backfire against the MBS.
Gail Goodwin of World Affairs Council Atlanta asks a question about Khashoggi human rights and President Biden's visit in the summertime, and to what extent the trade-off of giving that audience on Saudi turf to MBS has set a new frame for the relationship, for the bilateral relationship, and has it damaged human rights as a centerpiece of U.S. foreign policy? Does it make sense in the terms of U.S. strategic goals vis-a-vis China, Russia, and other rival powers to do this? What are your thoughts there?
Well, I've just written a piece that hasn't appeared yet, but it will appear shortly, with the title of which is something like Biden's Saudi trip widens rift with the Crown Prince. I think relations are worse than when he went, before he went.
Wow.
The fact that he publicly discussed the fact that he had raised the issue, Biden raised the issue with MBS, and he publicly said he did. He went out of his way to say it was at the top of my agenda, and I said, I held him personally responsible, and he told me he wasn't responsible. So he aired his whole dialogue with MBS on this issue, which is incredibly embarrassing to MBS.
Well, maybe to Biden too, because he called him a pariah in the campaign. And if
Well,
you go to visit a pariah, he's not a pariah.
well, now they're both embarrassed. But the other point, I don't see Biden got anything for his visit. It's a one-way. He's kind of has lent some legitimacy to MBS, but MBS hadn't given him anything. I mean, the OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, and Russia, and altogether they're, 13 and OPEC and another 10, so 23 producers. They've just decided they're not going to increase production. They're going to cut production in order to keep prices up high. The exact opposite of what Biden was hoping for before the elections in November. Now, this is totally symbolic because OPEC and its allies have not been able to, they've been steadily increasing from a very low level. The cuts they made just after COVID hit and the market collapsed. Each month they've been increasing, authorizing the increase of 400, 500, and in August, 680,000 barrels. But the group itself has not been able to fulfill its own goals.
Yeah.
So to order a cut now, as they have 100,000 barrels a day, is really meaningless, except it's a real slap in the face of Biden. Now, the other area where MBS on human rights, since Biden visited, 2 Saudi women, both aged 142, 148, both having children. They've just been sentenced to incredible lengths in jail. In the first case, she was on, and this is for their tweets. These are for tweets, social, exchanging tweets or taking a tweet and forwarding it about some degree of criticism of the government or of MBS. The first woman was, I think it's 35 years in jail for, and when she went on she went on appeal because I think it was only 6 years initially. Now it's 35 years on appeal. So, I mean,
that was a front page story in the Washington Post, your former paper.
And the other woman, we're just learning now, she's been sentenced for the same, it's called threat to the social fabric of the country or the stability of the country because of tweets or other messages sent on social media that are deemed critical. She's been sentenced to 45 years in prison. I mean, this is incredible. I mean,
so what does that say? Pamela Custer of our New Hampshire Council asks for the future of Saudi women and his reputation as a reformer, which is an area I want to go to next.
I think if you stay out of politics, keep your mouth shut, and I'm talking about women.
Yeah.
And the women have been very brave and challenging. I mean, you remember it was women who pushed to have the right to drive. And unfortunately, after he became prime minister, crown prince, he put these women in jail and then he went and authorized them to drive. I mean, that's kind of how mean he has been towards women. I think if women want to get ahead in Saudi society, they shouldn't see boo when it comes to politics, because this guy is going to be sure they're going to be monitored and pick up any troublemakers and do this and put them in jail. And this is a warning to them. But that doesn't mean you can't now get a job in some areas you couldn't get before, that you have, you can play sport. I mean, the social reforms are still going ahead. It's the political reforms that are going backwards and getting worse and worse.
Do you see that when you appraise Mohammed bin Salman against other major reformers of the Middle East over the past decades, where does he sit? How are his tactics different or similar? To what extent does individual leadership matter in making these judgments?
Well, my last chapter takes on that issue, because I was curious, how does his style of reformism compare to Gamal Abdel Nasser or the Shah or Bourguiba of Tunisia? And I go into the parallels and non-parallels between his style of rule and their style of rule. And I come out feeling that he's really unique. He has no political organization backing him. He has no political party backing him. He has, anyway, I go on and point out the differences between other reformers in the Middle East, and contemporary Middle East, and Mohammed bin Salman. And I find his position quite unique and his style quite unique.
How do you, I mean, is there one of those that he most closely reminds you of?
Well, sort of, you have.
I mean, none came so young to power, but in terms of.
Well, I think that I talk about the king's dilemma, which is really an expression taken from a political scientist here in the United States. And the king's dilemma refers to a reformist king who has on one side of him the old status quo powers that are against what he's trying to do. And on the other side, the group he's trying to appeal to keeps putting pressure, more and more pressure on this reformist king to keep reforming. And very often, the modernizing monarch is overthrown either by the left or the right. And a typical example now is the Shah, who tried to carry out reforms and did carry out some reforms, but never was able to get control of the religious groups or the Bazaris, and was finally overthrown. So that, I mean, that's one parallel. I don't, and the dilemma he faces. But the Shah, even he had some political party and he had some organized support. Mohammed bin Salman has nothing. He has no party, he doesn't want any politics. It's just him and the populace. And
it's very
his
interesting.
support is the security service, and it's a typical sort of dictator and his security service holding him in power.
We have 1 minute, and to me, one of the most interesting things is that in Iran, you have Ali Khamenei, who is been in power since '89, and he's not going to be alive forever. So there's a succession play there, and MBS's father will die, and that could really change the trajectory for his leadership before too long. And having both of these,
MBS or
well, I mean, MBS, what will happen in both countries, really? we have a succession plan for Saudi, but without the father, the family relationships, there could be rivals emerging and
Could be.
higher repression.
Certainly higher repression, can he hold it all together? Only thing we can say at this point is that he seems to have pretty good control. He's formed, this is too complicated to get into, but he has a lot of branches of the family, the younger members that are supporting him.
Yeah.
So I think he'll start out all right. I wonder whether you can't keep people down. The Saudi society that's getting more and more educated, excuse me, more and more educated. At some point, you gotta ask whether it's gonna explode socially.
Yeah.
They're gonna get fed up with this, where you can't say anything, no freedom of speech, no freedom of assembly. We don't know. It's certainly a possibility.
Well, David, thank you so much for joining us for this edition of Cover to Cover. David Ottaway's book is Mohammed bin Salman, the Icarus of Saudi Arabia. I know my colleagues will have a lot to report on when they return from their trip next week. And as councils host speakers from the kingdom and the region over the coming weeks and months, it'll be a very interesting conversation for sure. Thank you all for joining us. I want to remind everyone that we have Susan Shirk on China next month, which will be an interesting discussion given the party Congress that is likely to give Xi Jinping his permanent leadership that he has sought. We'll be talking to you next month on that. And again, David, thank you. Good afternoon to you and to all who turned out today.
Thank you and have a good trip.
Thanks so much. Take care, everybody.
Bye now.